we're talking about politics, of course, and we're talking about how to change it, which means that we're talking about how to change individual and collective behaviors, how to change economic systems, how to change social systems. Now, we all know that to change these things, we have to intervene at the level of culture. That's, for example, one of the important lessons we learned from feminism, that to change certain social dynamics, we have to intervene on culture first. Now, it's a bit like if we are building a house. To intervene on the top floor, say the first floor, we have to project the ground floor in a certain way. Let's say that the first floor is politics and the ground floor is culture. Now, culture, however, is the ground floor, but it's not the beginning of how we build the house, how we intervene on politics. There is a floor underneath it, and that's reality, metaphysics. And as I say reality, reality appears. Okay. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that whenever we discuss of cultural values, whenever we discuss of political values, we always have a ground zero of our understanding, which has to do with questions that are not usually examined politically. Questions of metaphysics, that is to say, questions about what we believe, first, what we believe existence is. What does it mean when I say that this piece of paper exists? What do I mean by that? Second, what kind of things exist in the world? And how do they exist? Now, when I say that, it sounds like I'm saying something really uncontroversial. But if you look through history, these ideas have changed a lot. And as they change, also in different parts of the world, still are quite different. As they change, they go to shape the field of what is possible or reasonable to do, to think, and to imagine. For example, this is something that we know in our own experience. When we are children, we have a certain type of metaphysics, which makes it possible for us to interact with things in a certain way. For example, toys are alive, and so we have a certain level of negotiation with them. As adults, toys are no longer alive, and so we throw them in the bin. Okay? You see that these kind of like small metaphysical changes change completely the relationship we have with things. Now, I am talking about metaphysics because I'm talking about politics. In a sense, politics is not an immediate work. We have to do some pre-political work. And I believe that starting from metaphysics is quite important, especially today. Now, let's change this word. Metaphysics is not a particularly sexy word. Let's call it reality system. It's a system, like a pair of glasses, that we put on our eyes when we look at the raw perceptions that come to us, and we order them in a system of reality. We can, as glasses, change them whenever we like, and it's important to keep that in mind. And there is no right and wrong in one system or another. We can change reality systems, and it's always subjective, whichever we put on, and it's always arbitrary, whichever we choose. However, the consequences of choosing one over the other are not subjective. They are very much objective. By putting on a certain pair of glasses, certain things appear, others disappear. By adopting a certain reality system, the field of the possible changes. Okay, since we are discussing politics in a contemporary setting, let's start just by looking at the reality system that we employ today and what are the consequences of it. This will be, of course, a very long discourse, so I'll keep it as short as possible. But let's say only that the reality system we have in place today, like every reality system, is centered around one rhythm, one melody, one music. That rhythm, that central melody that composes the way we look at reality today is language, absolute language. We tend to believe, whether we are aware of it or not, we base our decisions in business and in life and in politics on the idea that whatever exists can be tackled by language and transformed into linguistic categories. Think, for example, investments in big data. They make sense, such enormous investments, because we believe that it's possible to capture reality into language. First. Second, whatever is not capturable by language, whatever remains ineffable, whatever resists the capture of language, doesn't exist, doesn't really exist. That's, for example, why there's so much struggle in certain communities to have a voice and self-nominate themselves, claim an identity for themselves, because without that you don't exist. This is not necessarily the truth. It's just a truth that is contingent to a certain reality system. In a recent book, I called it the reality system of technique. But this system has objective consequences. For example, existence of things is no longer unconditional, but it depends on the context of language. Typical example of that is the situation of migrants who don't have documents. You have a strange situation in which, as you fall outside of linguistic categories, you go extinct before you die. You no longer exist, and the fact that you exist in the flesh is irrelevant. Now, operating politically, I try to intervene at that level. And I try to imagine what would it be like to, in order to achieve a different field of the possible, to change our idea of reality. And I tried by inserting a different first principle into my imagination of what reality is. That's the first principle of the ineffable. The ineffable, what we cannot say, what resists language. I'm not talking about ghosts or spirits, of course. I'm talking about something very simple. If I ask you to describe this microphone to me, you can speak for hours about everything, from the price it has to the molecular composition, the color, the history, everything. But if I ask you to describe, what do you mean when I say that this microphone is here? Tell me more about the fact that it's here, that it exists. You can't say anything more. Pure existence in itself, the fact that things are, is one of the most close things to us and one of the most resistant to language of all. The ineffable is simply the pure existence of things. In the reality system that we have today, when we look at somebody, when we look at something, we concentrate immediately on their linguistic part. What is their identity, what is their nationality, everything, okay? What is their bank account or whatever else, their ability to work, consumer choices. And we usually take away the fact that the most important and blatant thing about them is that they exist. And that is an ineffable fact. Rebuilding a reality system around that changes the field of the possible, of course. It is not a right decision or a wrong one. It is, of course, an arbitrary and subjective one, but objectively has different consequences. What happens if you embrace that kind of reality system? Of course, it would be too long to explain it now, but very simply, it means that whenever we create institutions, whenever we create discourses, when I say language, I mean everything, you know? You as with your own, or myself, Federico, I am a linguistic construct, okay? That's how I define myself. I am an institution in that sense. When we create things linguistically, if we base our idea of reality on the ineffable, we have to build them in a certain way. So in a way that lets the ineffable to shine through, that does not attempt to smother it, to suffocate it. The ethical imperative changes, is modified. In a certain sense, we no longer use language as such, but we use symbols. A symbol, differently from a sign, is something that doesn't substitute itself for the thing, but points towards it, saying the thing is far away, it's in that direction. Why am I trying to work on this? Because by changing these ideas in terms of reality, we change something very powerful. We change the field of the possible. And how do we change it? We change it because we change the realm of what is reasonable and what is a superstition. If I had talked to a medieval person about molecules and atoms, he would have laughed, saying, superstition. Microbes, superstition. That's why, for example, I recommended people not to take baths too often. Today, if I talk to a scientist and I talk about angels, he laughs and says, superstition. Okay? You see, the way in which superstition changes through history traces the way in which reality systems change through history. I was trying to find a situation in which the activity of a border patrol, of a border control, would be a superstitious activity. Okay? It would no longer be a reasonable activity. Letting thousands of migrants die in the Mediterranean Sea would be considered absurd, not a possibility. You can only obtain that result not with political engagement directly, but changing the reality systems. Now, but talking about culture, once you operate at that level, how do you... I've got a bit of time, good. Once you operate at that level, how do you affect also cultural production? Since we are in a setting of cultural producers, consumers, or people that work and live in this field. Of course, culture is affected if we change the reality system that we adopt to produce culture and to exist. Reality and culture have a strange double relationship. On the one hand, culture is the mouthpiece of the reality that sustains it, but on the other hand, culture reinforces certain reality systems. Okay, so it's like they make each other to a certain extent. Working on cultural production is important. A cultural production that is based on this idea that the first thing that you encounter of things is the ineffable, their ineffable existence, and that is the primary aspect, is no longer a culture as we know it today. It's a form of culture that we have known in the past and sometimes returns, and is usually called prophetic culture. Why do I say prophetic? For various reasons. Prophecy, prophenai, to speak out in front of an audience, is the strange situation of Moses, who is asked, for example in the Bible, to speak out in front of the assembled tribe of Israel about what God told him. So first of all, you have to speak out in front of people. You have to speak out about something that you cannot put down into words. It's an impossible task. Third, Moses has a stutter. You know, it's in the Bible, you know that Moses cannot speak articulately. So whenever you try, it's always going to be wrong. It's always an insufficient form of culture. It's never neat and precise. It's an impossible task, but that you have to do nonetheless. What exactly is the task of prophetic culture? A prophetic approach to culture has basically, whatever form or shape it takes, has basically only one important message, which is an attempt to remind the listeners, to remind the audience of this ineffable kernel, the ineffable kernel within things, to remind people of that presence that cannot be conveyed in any other way or through any other language. Not only that, but to remind people and the audience and the listening that that ineffable kernel has an ontological primacy. It comes ontologically first and deserves the first level of respect compared to language. That if you have to choose between sacrificing the ineffable or sacrificing a linguistic construct, you have no doubts. This sounds very theoretical, but if you think the way in which millions of people lost their lives in the First World War in the name of a flag, you see what I mean, okay? In order to be able to speak prophetically, you have to position yourself in a very strange situation. You are still speaking, you're still using language, you're still in the world, but you're also outside at the same time. You have 1 foot out and 1 foot inside the world. 1 foot outside and 1 foot inside of history, to a certain extent, which you engage directly, but from a strange lateral position. This strange position is exactly what prophetic culture provides. It doesn't provide products as such, but it provides positions. If you think about famous prophetic texts, for example, the Quran, the author of the Quran, if I ask you who is the author of the Quran, you probably say Muhammad. But the author of the Quran is not Muhammad. He receives the Quran from the Archangel Gabriel. So the author of a prophetic text is never the author, okay? The author is the first reader. Then the question is, how do you read the Quran? You would say you pick up the book and you read it. No, that's wrong, okay? You don't read the Quran like that. You read the Quran by becoming Muhammad. You read it by taking up the same position as the author itself. That's how prophetic culture works. You don't provide products, you provide positions from which you can contemplate and remind yourself of the ineffable. How does it speak? What is the style? The style is a bit weird, but it's quite specific. When you speak prophetically, you speak about many things at the same time, incompatible things. I take account of you in time, in history, in finance, in politics, in terms of your identity and so on and so forth, on the one hand. So if I talk of you, for example, I might talk of you as a man or a woman, okay? At the same time, I talk of you in terms of the ineffable kernel that you have that is beyond any possible categorization. How can I speak at the same time of two incompatible things? There is a way. you can do that by putting them together paradoxically. You create linguistic monsters. This is the grotesque form of language. Grotesque comes from when they first discovered Nero's villa in the 15th century in Rome. This shepherd was walking, fell into a hole, found Nero's villa and the Domus Aurea, and found on the walls all the paintings of this strange grotesque, because they were in this grotto. And they were figures, they were a leaf that becomes a serpent, that becomes a god, that becomes a cup. These figures were never closed onto themselves, were always one becoming the other, and they were always wrong. It was never fully a cup, never fully a snake, never fully anything. It's a language that is always somehow broken and open. But why? It's not an aesthetic choice. It's because it communicates by saying that you cannot position yourself fully within one level of existence alone. You cannot position yourself fully within language only. But you can also not position yourself fully within the ineffable, because you cannot live. We need a world in which to live. Keeping it open, embracing a grotesque style, that's exactly what it means. The same thing has to do with a relationship to other limits that we have to our life in the world. For example, we have to deal with identities, but we cannot deal with identities with the seriousness that we do usually. We have to deal with identities while at the same time reminding ourselves that they are just one veneer, one layer. How do we do that? We do that with a strange syncretic approach. Once again, we mix them together, we take them lightly, and we try them out in monstrous forms. Max Turner, this famous anarchist of the 19th century, said, for example, I will always find comrades that will fight my same battles without having to swear on my same flag. That's the kind of approach that you have. You understand that you have to have a flag of sorts, but you don't use it as a center of aggregation. And finally, what is the relationship that it has? And that's perfectly on time. It's good. What is the relationship that it has with time, and with our time in particular? Now, we are discussing contemporary art, and the bad news is that prophetic culture cannot be contemporary. By definition, prophetic culture cannot be locked within time, and especially cannot be locked within one time. It has to inhabit time on the one hand, and accept it, and navigate it. On the other hand, it has to be able to see the differences between past, present, and future as just a very thin layer, just a very small part of it. And at the same time has to understand that behind and underneath all those, in the ineffable fact of reality, there is something that escapes temporality itself, somehow that is eternal. Eternal doesn't mean infinite, it's something different. It doesn't mean a very long time, it means something outside of time. So it cannot be contemporary because it cannot be locked within time. It has to contain time and eternity at once. It has to become simultaneous. So, in a way, closing this now, I invite you to consider what would be a form of contemporary art that becomes simultaneous art, containing at the same time time and eternity. Thank you.